Hi class, in this video we are going to start with chapter 1, and the first question I have for you is if you were going to compare the field of psychology to some other fields, specifically art and philosophy and physics and chemistry, what is it most similar to? Is it exactly like art and philosophy? Is it in the middle, kind of halfway between? Or is it mostly like physics and chemistry? Where would it fall along this spectrum? No matter what answer you gave, well, I guess you could technically be wrong. It has to have a little bit of similarity to physics and chemistry in that psychologists who are doing research are using the scientific method. We can't just say this is what we think, so it has to be true. There has to be some scientific method. There has to be a certain procedure you follow. A lot of psychologists use statistics in their research. For my research, I do qualitative research using grounded theory. So from the outside, some people could look at that and think, it's qualitative. You're just analyzing stories. How is that with the scientific method? But it is. There are procedures you have to follow. There are things you have to do. So there are components, and especially some of the people we're going to talk about in this video, there are some components that kind of have the feel of philosophy, potentially art, but there's definitely some hard science stuff going on too. Next question I have for you. How many psychologists? Name some psychologists that you know. It can't be Dr. Phil. He's not allowed. But without looking it up, it doesn't matter how many you can name. You get the points for trying. But how many psychologists can you name? And for this, chances are you couldn't think of too many. Most people can think of Freud. That's kind of the one that most people can guess. Some of you might have thought of Pavlov. But by the end of the semester, you will know a whole bunch of psychologists. At this moment, you probably don't know many unless you took psychology in high school. And the reason I have you do this is because this class, more so than say you walk into physics. First day of physics, you're not like, oh, I've heard about physics. This is going to be easy. I know it. No, it's physics. With psychology, a lot of students think, I've heard about psychology. This is going to be common sense. It's going to be easy. You may have heard some aspects of psychology, but you really haven't, unless you've taken a class before, you haven't heard a lot about it, which is evidenced by the fact you probably can't name 10 psychologists, living or dead. So keep an open mind as we go through this semester. A lot of stuff that you think would be common sense, you think you already know about, maybe not so much. So what are we covering this semester? We're covering psychology. Psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. So we're focusing on those two things, inner processes and outer behaviors. Again, when we do psychological research, we are using the scientific method. You have to have a hypothesis. It's a tentative explanation. You also then do some research and create a theory, which is a broad explanation for some aspect of the natural world that is consistently supported by evidence over time. By the time someone gets to having a theory, it's not just their assumption. The research has backed up what the theory says. You also have the empirical method. The scientific method is a form of this. The empirical method is based on observation rather than logical arguments. It is you observing what is happening. Maybe because you're doing an experiment and you're manipulating factors. Maybe you're just doing a naturalistic observation, all the stuff you'll learn about in the next chapter. But we tend to use the empirical method in psychology. So what we're going to do now, we are going to transition to talking about different perspectives in psychology. And first, we're going to start with what I call the old school perspective. So these are the perspectives that are the original theories in psychology, the original perspectives. You will not see a lot of these today. Like, for example, the first one we're going to talk about, structuralism. You can't get a PhD in structural psychology now. There are no structuralists walking around. But it's important because it was one of the original theories in psychology. So first we're going to focus on old school theories. For the first theory, we're going to talk about, again, structuralism. Structuralism was created by Wilhelm Wundt. You only need to know last names, by the way. It's pronounced Wundt because he was German, so W is a V sound. He was the first person to be referred to as a psychologist. He created the first lab that was explicitly a psychology lab, and that was at his university in Leipzig, Germany, in 1879. And for his structuralism, what he focused on was structuralism. For all these perspectives, by the way, look at the title and it'll help you figure out what it's about. So if you look at the title, structuralism, structuralists are going to be focusing on the structure, the components of a psychological process. So you are understanding the structure or characteristics of the mind. For this, he used introspection. Introspection is when you have people examine their own conscious experience as objectively as possible. For example, if he was going to study anger, he would bring you into his lab, he would kick you, get you mad, and then say, okay, what's going on? Tell me everything you feel, tell me everything you think, tell me what's happening physiologically, what does it mean to be angry? So that is introspection. One of Wundt's students who he trained as a structuralist to do introspection was Edward Titchener. He was a British dude, but he ended up working at Cornell in the US. And one difference between Wundt and Titchener is Titchener thought you could do introspection on past events. So if you were studying anger, you didn't have to actually make someone angry in the lab. You could say, hey, think about the last time you were angry. What were your thoughts? What were your feelings? So it didn't have to be in the moment. And then the final name on here, Washburn, Margaret Washburn. She was the first woman to get a PhD in psychology, and she was the second woman to be the president for the American Psychological Association. So that is Margaret Washburn, a structuralist. Next perspective to go over is functionalism. Functionalism was created by William James. James is his last name. And he was really influenced by Darwin's theories of evolution, natural selection, that sort of thing. And again, look at that title. So functionalism focuses on how mental activities help an organism, a person, fit into their environment. So what is the function? What is the purpose of this mental process, this behavior? If James was going to study anger, he would think, what is the purpose of anger? What is the function of anger? How does getting angry in this situation help with your survival? Help you do well? So that's functionalism. This is the old school perspective. Again, you can't get a PhD in functionalism now. When we get to the modern perspectives, the modern perspective connected with this is the evolutionary perspective, evolutionary psychology. The other name you should know for functionalism is Mary Whiton Calkins. She was one of James's students. He worked at Harvard University, so she studied at Harvard with him. And when she did everything she needed to get her PhD, Harvard at the time was men's only school. And Radcliffe was a school nearby for women, so the sister school for Harvard. And so when she finished everything for her PhD, Harvard said, we can't give you a PhD from Harvard because you're a lady, and this is a guy school, so we're just going to put Radcliffe on your PhD. And she said, but I didn't go to Radcliffe. I have been working at Harvard. I want Harvard on my PhD. And so they said, then I guess you don't get a PhD. So she was supposed to be the first woman to get a PhD in psychology, but Harvard refused to give her one. So Margaret Washburn became the first woman. What Mary Whiton Calkins was the first one to do, she was the first female president for the American Psychological Association in 1905. So missed out on the PhD because Harvard was sexist, but she got the first presidency. The next perspective to go over is the psychoanalytic perspective. This is Freud, Sigmund Freud's perspective. He really focused on the unconscious mind, and this is where you put all your feelings, all your urges, all your memories that you're not aware of. You cannot easily access, you are not aware of what is in your unconscious mind. The way you do access these is through things like dreams. So if you've ever heard of someone say, I dreamt about this, I must be really thinking about it. That's a Freudian idea. Another way to try to get at what is in your unconscious is through what they call free association, which is when you say the first thing that comes to your mind, so you just kind of ramble. And another way to get through to what is happening here is through, in your unconscious, is through slips of the tongue. So if you're trying to get out of taking a test, and so you write your professor and say, I can't take the test this Friday because my dog just lied, instead of saying my dog just died, that would be a Freudian slip. What's in your unconscious, you feeling bad about lying to your professor, comes out in the email. So dreams, Freudian slips, and free association. For the psychoanalytic theory in general, this theory is going to focus on the role that your unconscious plays in your personality. And a big part of what is in your unconscious is based, and thus your personality, is based on what happened in your childhood. So childhood is really important, unconscious is really important, and sexual urges, specifically in childhood, very important to Freud. In the personality chapter, we'll talk about Freud much more in depth. We'll get into his psychosexual stages. At this point, that's all you need to know for him. Next old school perspective is the Gestalt perspective. Gestalt, you might have heard that word from art or from math class. The three names you should know for Gestalt are Wertheimer, Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kafka, and Wolfgang Kohler. They immigrated to the U.S. from Germany. All of them were Germans, but then to avoid Nazis, came to the U.S. and actually helped during World War II with some psychological research. In general, Gestalt translates to whole, and the idea with the Gestalt perspective is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So this is going to focus on, we'll talk about Gestalt principles in the sensation and perception chapter. So how your perception can be more than what the sensations actually coming in are. Yeah, so big in sensation and perception. Modern day sensation and perception research is the old school Gestalt perspective. That's all you got to know for Gestalt. Next, old school perspective, behaviorism. Behaviorism, there are some modern day behaviorists, maybe not as hardcore as some of these guys, but modern ones exist. In general, the behaviorists are going to focus on observable behavior. So it's all about observable behavior and how your environment influences your observable behaviors. 3 names to know. 1, Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov. He is the person who discovered classical conditioning. This is when you learn to pair a neutral stimulus with an unlearned stimulus and its reaction. Again, at this point, this is general. We will do a whole chapter where you will learn a lot about classical conditioning. But this is Pavlov with his dogs, teaching dogs to salivate when they heard a bell or when they saw a light switch. Neutral stimulus paired with something natural, salivating when they smelled meat. That's classical conditioning. Your environment affects you. Watson, John Watson, also a behaviorist. He focused on operant conditioning. Again, something we'll talk about in the learning chapter. He focused more on voluntary behaviors rather than involuntary behaviors like Pavlov. So if you use timeouts to punish a kid, that is you trying to have the environment affect the kids' voluntary behaviors. You want them to not be a brat by giving them a negative consequence when they do this behavior. Watson was definitely a little hardcore. He had a famous expression, which I'll butcher, something about like, give me a well-formed infant and my own environment in which to raise him, and I can turn him into anything I want, be it a lawyer, a doctor, a beggar, man, or thief, something like that. Basically, who you are, how you act, is totally based on your environment. That is hardcore behaviorism. The final name to know for behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. He's the one that created the Skinner box. If you take learning here at McDaniel, there is a lab with Skinner boxes. The most common animal that's used in a Skinner box and the animal that is used at McDaniel is not a rat. It is actually a pigeon. So there is a pigeon lab at McDaniel, and that was Skinner. So he focused, similar to Watson, on your behaviors and how your behavior is affected by consequences. A good consequence, you'll do the behavior more. Negative consequence, you'll do the behavior less. Next perspective is the humanistic perspective. Now, the humanistic perspective is sometimes called the third force because this perspective was created specifically against behaviorism and the psychoanalytic perspective. One thing behaviorism and the psychoanalytic perspective have in common is that they both focus on how you don't have a lot of control over who you become. In the psychoanalytic perspective, it's childhood experiences. In behaviorism, it's your environment. But you don't get a say either way. And the humanists thought that sounded horrible They thought it was too deterministic, too pessimistic, and so they created humanism. Humanism is the perspective in psychology that emphasizes the potential for good that is innate in all people. So it is going to focus on how you are your own expert, that you are trying to reach your fullest potential. Kind of the rose-colored glasses version of psychology. A couple of names to know. One, Abraham Maslow. He's the one that created the hierarchy of needs. So we'll talk about him in the motivation chapter when you learn about the hierarchy of needs. So the basic idea of hierarchy of needs, you have basic needs and then you have more complex needs. And as long as your basic needs for survival are met, then you can focus on the more complex needs. The most complex need, the top of the hierarchy, is self-actualization. Self-actualization is when you reach your fullest potential. You become as awesome as you potentially can be. Most people don't reach that. Carl Rogers is the other name to know. Carl Rogers put a clinical therapy twist on the humanistic perspective. He created client-centered therapy, which is the humanistic therapy. 3 main tenets to know for the client-centered therapy that Rogers created. You have unconditional positive regard. So your therapist is always going to be supportive of you. Their approval is not based on what you do. Genuineness and empathy. And that is it for the humanistic perspective. There are a couple more old school perspectives, and that will be the end for this video. In the next one, I will talk about modern perspectives, and then we will watch a video connected with it as well. So a couple more old school ones, as well as a brief discussion of a couple of organizations in psychology, and then this video is done. Next one, cognitive perspective. This is one there is a modern version as well. You can get a PhD in cognitive psychology. You can take that as a class at McDaniel. This was created by Neisser, and the reason I say that is he started a magazine called Cognitive Psychology in 1967, and it really sort of revived an interest in the mind. After structuralism and functionalism, when behaviorism came about, not a lot of people were focusing on the mind, because the behaviorist said, if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. You can't see inside the mind. And so people stopped really focusing on what was going on inside the mind. With this cognitive revolution, it was called, it kind of brought that back to the forefront. People started to focus on what was going on in the mind. And so this is going to study things like memory, language, thinking, intelligence, some sensation and perception. A lot of stuff can fall into cognitive psychology. Another name to know is Noam Chomsky. His research focused on language development, so what's going on in your mind. He had what was called the LAD, language acquisition device. So how you're sort of born programmed to learn language, learn grammar. But again, that's what's going on in your mind. Final perspective for, or final slide video. We have the multicultural perspective. The multicultural perspective, the name you need to know is Francis Cecil Sumner. He was the first African American to get a PhD in psychology in 1920. Random fact for you. He got his PhD from Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And that's also where I got my PhD. And he is also besides being the first African American to get a PhD in psychology, he's also famous for starting the psychology program at Howard University in DC. And a lot of the early work in multicultural psychology focused on intelligence testing and kind of how racist it started out in this country. And so looking at variances in how you should test and what should be called intelligence based on your background. And the final thing for this slide, APA, APS. The APA, when I talk about the APA this semester, APA stands for the American Psychological Association. It is the largest organization for psychologists in the world. There are divisions within the APA based on what your interests are. For example, I am a member of 3 divisions of the APA. I'm a member of Division 2, which is for teaching psychology, since that's my job. Division 45, which is the multicultural division, because a lot of my research looks at issues cross-culturally, cross-racially. And then I'm very active in Division 48, which is the Peace and Conflict division, because most of my research has been with Rwanda and the genocide and how to get people to not kill each other. So depending on what your interests are, there is a division in APA for you. And students are welcome to join. It's usually very cheap to join a division. Every year they have a big convention in August where you can present research. If you are a clinical psychologist, therapist, you have a license, it is accredited through the APA. The APS is the American Psychological Society, and this is a little more research focused compared to the APA. It was founded in the late 80s, 1988, and it focuses more on the science of psychology. You're not going to get a license to be a therapist from APS, just from APA. So that is where I'll stop for this video. Again, next video we'll start in on modern perspectives.